Hi, thanks for joining us for our Technology, Privacy, and Security webinar for sex workers. This webinar is led by Dia Kayyali, an activist, writer, and attorney who has worked around anti-surveillance activism with the EFF, or the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and who's done a lot of work with communities that are especially prone to surveillance. We're also joined by Christina Dolgan, the director and founder of Red Light Legal, an amazing legal clinic for sex workers. Christina Dolgan is also an attorney. My name is Catherine Koster, and I'm the Communications Director for Sex Workers Outreach Project, and the only person on this webinar who is not a JD at the moment. So if you guys would like to introduce yourselves.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Dia, and I think that was a pretty good introduction. I'll just say a little bit about my background doing these sorts of webinars and trainings. I have done privacy and security education mainly for activists, both people working in the U.S. and working outside of the U.S. And basically just really excited to share this information with folks today. And I do just want to put out the caveat there that this is a work in progress. We all chatted with each other quite a bit before doing this, but some of the materials that we're going to share with you today, I'm really excited to get feedback about so that we can share them with more people. So I hate it when people call me an expert. I think I just have some information that might be helpful, and actually all of you are the experts on what you need. So happy to get feedback after the webinar.
Great, thank you so much, Dia. Christina, would you like to introduce yourself and talk a little bit about Red Light Legal before we get going on questions that people pre-submitted?
Sure. Hi everyone, my name is Christina and I'm the director of Red Light Legal, which is a nonprofit based in Oakland, California. And we're a legal services organization that is run by and for sex workers to provide services to people working in the industry in California and other places. And we have worked with Dia in the past, actually, after Red Book was shut down by the FBI and the local police department. Sex workers went into a panic, understandably, unsure of what the legal parameters were and what the legal risks were for having that information taken by the government. But also, people wanted to be proactive in that they wanted to better learn how to protect their sensitive information, both from people that could put them into legal risk, but also friends, family members, people who didn't necessarily like or understand their job, and wanted to better set themselves up if something happened in the future. So we're super excited to be part of this training today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Christina. And now I'm going to just sort of give a brief overview of what this webinar is going to, just the basic structure of this webinar, and then we're going to go into an overview of some of the questions you guys submitted when you were registering. First of all, this webinar is going to be available on YouTube after this presentation. So we're not going to take vocal questions during the actual presentation to protect y'all's anonymity. You can write questions. There's a chat function on the page that you are watching this webinar on. So please, 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 if you have any questions during the webinar, type those questions out, and we will make sure to get to them during the webinar or during the question and answer section. The basic structure of this webinar is we're going to go over questions that have been pre-submitted, questions that you're going to ask right now about what's really important to you. Then Dia's going to go through a PowerPoint sort of talking about threat modeling and how you as an individual can think about What kinds of threats to your, your privacy and your security are you encountering when you are using a smartphone, when you're using the internet, and figuring out what's important to you and what tools you can use. We're going to go through a few different case studies that we've pre-created, and again, these case studies are sort of intended to give you an idea of how you can work through your own security and privacy priorities, and your level of tech savvy or willingness to use some some less convenient ways of getting stuff done to protect your own data. And then we're going to open it up to questions and answers. Does that sound right, Dia? Yes, okay, cool. All right, so let's get started with some of the pre-submitted questions that you had. One sec. Okay, so the questions that we got pre-submitted were texting. How do you delete Gmail or online tracks? Questions about IPOs, email storage, forms sent via a website, and texting. And then VoIP numbers and how to tell, and questions around that. Can we ask questions during the webinar? And the answer is yes, absolutely. There's a sort of legal question about wording and language and wording ads. Maybe, Christina, you can sort of address that briefly after the PowerPoint presentation. And then a few questions about VPN services and encryption. And then questions about, secure email hosts. Is it better to have an overseas email host or a website host? Hiding your IP addresses. Call forwarding services like Google Voice. What are good options for using a phone when you don't want it traced back to you? And I think that that's about all. What other questions do you guys out in the audience have? If that looks like a good overview of sort of the kinds of core questions that you guys have, okay, great. So another one that came up is tips for crossing international borders safely. So for example, if you're going to be taking a trip overseas and you're about to face the U.S., Customs and Border Control Department, are there some things that you should think about in terms of tech security, locking your phone, locking your laptop? And then, I think, when we're discussing language and images for ads, I think it's really important to point out that, as one of our viewers did, that someone in South Carolina was recently arrested based solely on her back page ads. So this can also create a real liability, although Christina can talk more about that issues after the tech and privacy section of the webinar. So, Dia, are you ready for me to pass it on to you?
Yeah, and I'll say I think that usually lots of questions come up as we're going through. So I'm gonna I'll have the slideshow in front of me and won't be able to see all of the questions, but I'm gonna come back to the chat room, and so I definitely am happy to try to answer questions as I'm going through if I can, but if not, don't worry, you'll have lots of opportunities, and I think some stuff will come up as we're going through the presentation. So with that, I will just go ahead and get started. Give me a moment here. Sharing turn on. Okay. All right. Catherine or Christina, since you guys have mics too, does that look all right? Can you see everything?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, great. So please feel free to write my email address down. I'm happy to answer questions after this. And as I mentioned, I'm hoping that if you see stuff in the materials that you think doesn't look right, or you have additions, that you will let me know. I'm really hoping that this is not a one-time thing, but that we all get to keep sharing information with each other. So have to have the disclaimer in there, of course. a lot of this stuff, people in the privacy and security world debate about. So this is just my understanding based on the trainings that I've done in my work at EFF. And this is definitely not legal advice, although I am a lawyer. Security harm reduction. Why am I talking about harm reduction? It's actually, just a second here, I'm going to turn on a timer since I can't see my clock, and I want to make sure we have lots of time for questions. Okay. So the reason I like to talk about security in harm reduction terms is because perfect security and privacy aren't possible, and feeling like they are for a lot of folks is going to make you feel overwhelmed and like you don't even want to get started. There's no way to avoid security and privacy risk if you are an average person using the internet. That's even more so if you're a sex worker, particularly if you're doing anything that involves using the internet. So the goal today is really just to give you tools so that you can figure out what your own risk is and use appropriate tools and habits to make yourself safer. But don't worry, we're not trying to have perfect security. That's just not possible. So the first thing that you want to do before saying, I need to learn how to use encrypted email, I need to encrypt all of my devices, anything like that, the first thing you want to do is actually assess your own risk. So you want to go through these 6 questions, and a lot of times if you're looking at other materials, you'll see this listed as threat modeling. I like to use risk assessment because it's a little bit less of a militaristic term, and I think it just sounds more approachable. So the questions that you're going to go through, and 2 of them are kind of the same, but I like to include both of them to be specific. What do you want to protect? Who do you want to protect it from? How likely is it that you will need to protect it is 2 questions. How motivated are your adversaries, and what skills or technology do they have at their disposal to use? How bad are the consequences if you fail to protect yourself? And how much trouble are you willing to go to prevent those consequences? So these are the questions that we actually went through and thought about, for a couple of hypothetical folks, what this would look like. And so I'm going to go through the rest of the slides, and then we'll actually talk about one of those case studies so that you can get more of an idea. So the first question, what do you want to protect? This is going to depend very much on who you are. But just to give you an idea of what sorts of things we're talking about. Oh yes, and also just a point that I like to make, that it's, a lot of times when we say, what do you want to protect, you might automatically think about data or location. But I also just want to make clear that, of course, this is mainly about you, but sometimes the question is also, who do you want to protect? So it might be contacts that you have. It might be, we're going to talk a lot about sex work, but one of the things we also talked about was, a lot of folks are also doing organizing and activism around their work, around other topics. So it might be the folks that you're organizing with. So sometimes the question is, who do you want to protect? Now that being said, here's some of the things that we thought of that you might want to think about protecting. The first one, of course, is a huge one and brings up all sorts of things and is, I think, a lot of what we're going to talk about, but separate identities for sex work and for other purposes. Your legal name, your biometric data, so that's things like fingerprints, pictures of your face that can be used for facial recognition, tattoos, DNA. There's a pretty astounding array of the biometric data that law enforcement can now use to identify you. So there's also other pretty strange things like hand geometry, vein pattern recognition, gait recognition. So these are all sorts of things that law enforcement might be able to identify you using. Location and IP address. And location can be also movements, so the sorts of movements that that cell phone tracking might reveal. Search history and browsing history, so what you're doing online. Contacts and address book. identities of people you're in contact with, which I chatted a little bit about before. Passwords, this is a huge one. Credit card number, but also other financial information. So one of the things we'll mention, is like depositing cash, things like that. Text messages, both who you're texting and the content of those, as well as, and the same goes for all of these, phone calls, emails, chats, and instant messages. Both the content, but also who it is that you're in contact with, or things that you might want to think about. Who are your potential adversaries? This is unfortunately a super long list. Again, this is really going to depend on who you are, what kind of work you're doing, any other legal issues you might have, how your family feels about your work, all sorts of things. Cops, of course, are at the top of the list, but local law enforcement, but also federal law enforcement. The FBI, the NSA, probably not for most of you, but the NSA also does share information with the FBI, so it's important to include that there. The IRS might be a big one for a lot of folks. ICE, so Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Other government agencies. So one of our case studies, we talked about somebody who is receiving government benefits. So those other government agencies might be people you want to keep data from. And then, there are people that you're related to or you have some other relationship with. So your school, your boss, other family members. There's also people who you used to know. An abusive spouse or an abusive former partner, people you used to trust. Stalkers, that can be people you've never met or people you have met. The media, this is a big one, especially for people who are doing organizing. Casual Googlers, this is, again, for folks who are trying to keep identities separate, particularly if they're doing sex work that has a big online aspect. SWORFs and other harassers, I know folks have experienced on Twitter or other social media platforms being harassed by people, especially people who are active and public around sex work, have experienced harassment, particularly from, unfortunately, sometimes from sex work exclusionary radical feminists, prison officials, and corporations. So this is not a complete list, of course. There are things I'm certain that I've missed, and as we're going to talk about who your potential adversaries are, again, depends on who you are. If you are somebody who is doing street-based sex work, cops are going to be really at the top of your list. If you are using a site like sites that have been rated, like My Red Book, you might be thinking pretty strongly about the FBI. If you're doing, well, I think we'll go through the case studies, and I'll finish going through this risk assessment, and we'll talk about the case studies to flesh this out a little bit.
We just got a question from the audience, and it says, is Homeland Security concerning themselves with us now bizarrely? Can you or Christina answer that? Or can you speak to that, Dia?
Christina, do you want to jump in? Do you have any thoughts on that? And then I can...
Is Homeland Security concerning themselves with us now? And the Patriot Act. That was a question relating to the different...
okay.
Yeah, Dia, why don't you start, and if there's anything supplemental, I can jump in, but you probably know better than I.
Sure. So, one of the things that has happened somewhat recently is that, so I'll say the answer is I don't know 100%. I will say that definitely after the Patriot Act, the surveillance that the government could do was increased. So a lot of folks who've been following the Snowden leaks know that one of the big things that was revealed was this bulk phone records collection, where the NSA was collecting details about who everybody was calling. And this can be really revealing, even though it's not necessarily the contents of phone calls. So I'll say, in general, surveillance is increasing, and people of all different sorts of identities are increasingly being treated as criminals. Now, in terms of how that's been focused on sex workers, you know, I think the raids of My Red Book and Rent Boy, as Christina mentioned, you know, those really scared a lot of people. As far as I know, and I could absolutely be wrong, but as far as I know, those raids were really focused on the people who were operating those sites, right? So we know that the FBI has a lot of resources at its disposal, and that they are more and more targeting sites that facilitate sex work. In terms of how much the feds are actually focusing on sex workers, I think they have more resources, so it's easier for them, but I don't think they're necessarily focusing more on individual people. But that being said, you know, I think it is easier for them. So in a I think people are increasingly going to see evidence that is related to online behavior or evidence that's been gathered using some of the technology I'm going to talk about in prosecutions. So, and also we do know that in addition to the raids, the other thing that happened over the last couple of years was a lot of financial censorship. So we do know, for instance, that people suspect, we don't know as much as we would like, that the IRS has been involved in shutting down accounts that are used or are perceived to be used for sex work or even just by sex workers. Yeah. Christina, do you have anything you want to add?
I mean, the only thing that I really have to add to that is, or I guess really highlight some of the things you just said is, you know, when you're dealing with technology, you never know who's listening. You never know. I mean, that's just part of our surveillance culture is there's no really definitive answer to any of those. That being said, you know, if the question of, you know, is somebody you know, looking at conversations or looking to prosecute somebody or arrest somebody and prosecute something, it really comes down to resources. And it's just, as we're doing here, a risk assessment. The likelihood that, you know, a gigantic agency like the FBI or Homeland Security is going to be going after individual sex workers is fairly low. It's just too resource intensive to go after people for, you know, misdemeanor charges. You know, and again, you know, the people that, and not to say that they won't do that, especially in tandem with local PD, you know, where that is what they do. But to go after individuals in that way is it's labor intensive and resource heavy, and they just don't want to spend the money that way. They are going after, and as we're saying, they're going after, you know, people who are working together, going after what they are perceiving as like sex trafficking stings or IRS evaders, where you know, it's going to be felony charges, it's going to be looking at conspiracy charges, that kind of thing. So you know, not to say that this can't, you know, I don't mean to construe this as legal advice, but my feeling is that this is going to be relatively low, you know, on their radar.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, one of the things that that came up after the site raids is that I shared with folks is that a difference now as opposed to pre-Patriot Act is that there is tons of information sharing. So information that's gathered by the FBI, like it's easier for local law enforcement to get that. Again, you know, local law enforcement, that's still, we haven't seen the effects of that yet, but that is something to keep in mind for the future. Okay, so, and thank you for that, Christina. So yeah, so that's actually a really good segue into the next, slide, if I can. So how likely is it that you're going to need to protect the things that we talked about? How motivated are your adversaries, and what are their capabilities? So these are two different questions, but they're very related. And what we were just talking about is a perfect example. let's say you're somebody who was using my Red Book, and your information has now been gathered. How motivated is the FBI to directly prosecute you, right? We know that their capabilities are greater than local law enforcement. The FBI, definitely the NSA, of course, but also the FBI. They have more access to more technological resources. Anybody who has heard in the news about the Apple encryption debate, the FBI eventually figured out how to get into these messages. They just kept trying and trying and trying. So they have a lot of capabilities, but they might not be motivated to get you specifically, right? They're going after site operators. Now, conversely, one of the examples that we have in the case studies that I just created, so you might not be seeing this one, but it should be in that the Google Doc link that I sent you so you can comment on it. Is somebody doing street-based work, especially in a city that that is politically conservative or where the Vice Squad has a lot of support, right? Local cops are going to be very motivated. Fortunately, they're not going to have as much technology, access to as much technology. That being said, we also know local law enforcement does tons of social media surveillance now. Here in San Francisco, for instance, there's an Instagram officer who sits there and trolls the Instagrams of people who are on probation. We know that Black Lives Matter activists, like that hashtag, there's been tons of surveillance of that. So how likely is it that you'll need to protect these things is going to depend on these two questions. And I can't stress enough, thinking about the motivation of your adversaries and thinking about their capabilities. This is one of the things that will really make what you do, what habits you focus on, and what tools you decide to use manageable. It's not always easy to answer these questions, particularly the question of what are their capabilities and what technology do they have access to. That's something that I think about every day. It might, for you, require a little bit more work to figure it out for your specific situation. In some of the case studies, I did a little bit of background research, and I'll chat about that for this question. Okay, how bad are the consequences if you fail? Again, this is a very personal question, but just some of the things that came up: embarrassment, private data made public, sometimes leading to offline harassment. So this is, if your legal identity is discovered, sometimes private data made public can also be people getting doxxed. I know, and doxing is when things like your personal phone number, your home address, and your legal name are made public, oftentimes in connection with the identity you're trying to keep separate from that. I know this has happened to activists. I think it's also, a potential, especially for folks who do a lot of online work, and if they have stalkers or if they have people who are harassing them, that experience can happen. Financial losses, including loss of government benefits or a tax audit, and I'll talk a little bit more about the government benefits. Children taken away, this one came up just specifically because of one of the case studies that we did. It's really, it's a really awful one. Jail, of course, and government harassment. This is, for activists, but really for anybody. And actually, I should back up a second and say that this training is mostly U.S. specific, because there are the legal regime in different places is so different that it would be hard to try to do something that's totally international. But this one particularly, the government harassment one, is particular for people outside of the states. There's some really and especially people doing activism, there's some really incredible international organizing going on, and people are really putting themselves, are incredibly bravely putting themselves in harm's way for the work that they're doing, and this is very much a potential consequence for them. So this is the final question in risk assessment. how much trouble are you willing to go to prevent the consequences that the potential consequences for you. So you're balancing the consequences against the difficulty of adopting certain tools and practices. Not everybody needs to know how to use encrypted email. This is I put this in here because sometimes the most important thing, and again we'll mention this in the case study. Sometimes the most important thing is actually just cleaning up your social media profile, right? It really depends on you, your particular risk, and what you've decided you're gonna do. So before I go through the rest of my slides, I think it would be helpful to actually talk about one of the case studies. Christina and Catherine, does that sound okay to you?
Yeah, that sounds great. I was on mute. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to turn off the screen sharing. All right. All right. Is the screen sharing is off now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So let me actually open this as a separate tab, and then go through. So actually,
I've got it on my screen, so I can.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Cool. And you can just. There you go. So tell me where you want me to move to, and I can do that.
Let's move down to. I'm just going to go through the first case study, Danny's.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Okay.
Great. Okay. Great. All right, and I see that there's lots of questions, by the way, which after we've gone through everything, I am going to take a look at those. This is great. I'm so happy that people are asking questions. All right. So Danny is a single mom. Who's taking care of her kids. She works at a club. She goes to school. She receives government benefits and financial aid. She has sole custody of her kids, and with her former partner who sucks. So she has to deal with family court. He harasses her a little bit, and she's just trying to keep her benefits, go to school, and keep a certain amount of anonymity. So if you could scroll down a little bit, Catherine. Oh, and actually, it looks like. Okay, great. So each of the things we noted bring up information she wants to protect. And this is part of the reason why I talk about case studies being so individual, because it's not just about the kind of work you do. And this is one of the things we realized as we were talking about this webinar. We were like, there's so many different variables. So it's not just about the kind of work you do. It's about all sorts of other things. So in this case, for Danny, the financial aid and the fact that she has to deal with a court sometimes, and that she's dealing with these government agencies, she really wants to protect her financial information. She wants to keep information about what she does for a living private in general as well. Who does she want to protect it from? So her former partner. He could try to, because of her job, particularly, if he thinks she's making tips and she's not reporting them or whatever, he could try to embarrass her in family court. It could give him a way to mess with her. She wants to protect her financial information from all of those government sources of financial aid. Financial aid is based on need. If she's making income that she's not reporting, and her school or CalWORKs or Section 8 finds out, she could lose her aid. As we mentioned before, the IRS is a concern if you're making tips, especially if you're depositing cash. And and she also just wants to keep her place of employment private, just because she just doesn't want to deal with her family, doesn't want to deal with people at school. So we could scroll down a little bit. I just realized I was like trying to scroll the screen share. Yay, technology. So how motivated are they, and what resources do they have at their disposal? So I did a little bit of research for this portion. I just researched online. I had my suspicions, but I wanted to make sure I was giving you good information. So Danny's former partner seems as if he's pretty motivated. He's bitter. He's a jerk. He's trying to take his kids away from her, not even necessarily because he wants them, but because he's trying to fuss with her. On the plus side, at least as far as security and privacy goes, Danny knows that he's uncomfortable around computers. He's not necessarily going to know, how to do anything really bad to her. But the reason I put that specific comment in there is because one of the things that security and privacy trainers have seen, particularly like when working with domestic violence survivors, is that there are spy apps that people can put on your phone, right? So they can track your movements. There are, people, if you were dating somebody who was a computer expert, they could put malware on your computer and maybe log your keystrokes, get your passwords, things like that. And some of this stuff takes technical know-how, some of it doesn't. But that's just something to think about. So the one thing Danny's concerned about is just dealing with him on Facebook. So he's motivated, doesn't have a ton of resources. Facebook, however, is a good resource for him. Government sources of financial aid. So as far as I know, agencies like CalWORKs are not necessarily actively searching social media yet. That being said, analytics on social media and big data are cheaper, are getting cheaper all the time and are getting easier. More and more agencies are using social media. And there are other ways that people are being surveilled, right? Electronic benefit transfer cards track your spending, and aid recipients have actually reported having caseworkers scan and question purchases and things like that. So that's something to keep in mind. And as far as the actual surveilling of social media, well, CalWORKs might not be doing that. The IRS has started doing that. So I found a report that the IRS is actually using predictive analytics on social media to try to dig up dirt on people they believe are dodging taxes. So this is, if they, this is, again, a question of motivation. In your case, like they're using this most likely for people who would owe them a lot more money. In a couple of years, they might be using it on more folks. So this is just something to think about. Again, this is social media is an issue with the court. Private investigators, but also court investigators are definitely using social media for hearings. And Catherine, could you scroll down a little bit? Awesome. Yeah, so it's more and more common to be using posts on Facebook as evidence in a hearing. So that is again something to think about. And I guess one thing I didn't include here, what resources do they have at their disposal? Because it's not something necessarily technological, but it's something to think about. When you turn over your information to a third party, you have less of a, legally speaking, you have less of an expectation of privacy, and that definitely goes for financial information. As I mentioned, right, if you're, whatever you're doing with your bank, you should assume that that is going to be available to the IRS, and that it could potentially be available to other government sources. So the IRS, certainly if you're being audited, your banking habits are something that the IRS could look at. So, and I will say, just caveat, like, this is not complete. This is why I'm saying please feel free to make notes here. But this is just an example. So how bad are the consequences if Danny fails to protect her information or fails to protect sources of the source of her income, maybe the fact that she's not reporting all of it, and that she's making more money than the financial aid office thinks. Also, in terms of on social media, like she tries to not to keep where she works off of social media and keep that identity separate. So, she thinks people shouldn't care, and she's not embarrassed about her work. She just wants to keep that separate. So, if she fails, could be stressful. She could be harassed at school. She could lose financial aid. That would be a really awful consequence. She could lose other government assistance. That would be a huge problem for her. She could get audited by the IRS and owe back taxes. She could lose custody either because of her former partner, or if the court gets suspicious and there's more of an investigation, things like that. And then, of course, like if she doesn't keep her address and I didn't go much into the stuff about customers and that sort of private information, but I just wanted to include it in there. So how much trouble is Danny willing to go to prevent those consequences? So in this case, for her, there's actually some pretty good things she can do. Change all her passwords. The reason I included this is because she's worried about a former partner. Sometimes people use passwords over and over again. Sometimes they don't change them very often. If he was able to figure out even one of her passwords and she had reused them, he could gain access to her private information, and that could be a real problem for her. So change all of her passwords and make them long and secure. And this is just something that if you don't do anything else after this webinar today, that's something I would love everybody to do. Go change your passwords. And we're going to talk more about passwords later. Be very careful about what you post on social media. Don't mention making tips. Use the word cash sparingly. Just be careful about what you're posting, both in terms of, even if you have your account settings locked down, like people can take screenshots, right? So don't post anything that you wouldn't want in the hands of your, or Danny's not going to post anything that she wouldn't want her former partner to see. She knows they still have friends in common, so she's careful about that. She's also thinking about, long-term, like, analytics, right? Like if she says cash over and over again, that could be a problem. So I'm not going to go through, like, there's other things that she could do. I'm not going to go through all of them, but hopefully folks found that helpful. Any questions before I go back to the PowerPoint?
Yeah. I think that some people had a question about, like, okay, let's say Danny had a bunch of pictures of her with, like, cats and cash all over her Facebook page and possibly, like, on Tits and Sass and, not only on her own thing. Do either of you guys have tips for how to reduce that former online presence, especially with things like web archiving and stuff? Is there anything that can be done around that?
So we chatted a little bit about this, and Catherine, I know you were talking about DMCA takedowns. This is not something that I've had a lot of experience with. So I don't know if you wanted to say a few words about that, or Christina, if you had any thoughts. Did that? Sorry, did you guys hear me?
Oh no, could you repeat what you just said, Dia?
Yeah, I was just saying that Catherine, I know you and I had talked about DMCA takedown, so maybe if you wanted to talk a little bit about that, I haven't had experience. And then Christina, if you had any other thoughts on reducing your former footprint. I will say that before I started doing this work independently, a lot of my work was really focused on, like, keeping things up, so I've had less experience with getting them taken down.
Okay, yeah, so there are a few tools you can use if you want to erase your web presence, and what I know of is sort of minimal damage and not super tech savvy. The first thing you can do is I think that escorts will realize, and people who are in adult film, that websites sort of scrape content from websites like Backpage or like the erotic review. So your photographs and your ad content can wind up on like 1,000 different pages. You know, and if you get arrested or if you have a partner who's stalking, you have a lot of work to do to take things down. A lot of those letters, if you go to the SWOP-USA website, and I'll post a link, there are a lot of template Digital Millennial Copyright Act templates. And these templates basically say that I am the sole owner of this content, and I did not authorize its posting here. I'm giving you a chance to take it down. You as the host of this website are required to take it down if it was posted by a third party. And most of the time people will take that content down almost immediately. For websites like the Erotic Review or websites that have reviews posted, those things take a little bit of a different tactic. You can send a DMCA takedown notice, you can have a lawyer email them, and people have reported to me that that's a fairly successful way of getting those taken down. And then you can also just keep on asking them in a persistent way to get that information removed. And then I don't really have any answers about how to get rid of a more long-lasting online footprint, because if you go online, you can like Wayback Machine allows you to see the website's content, you know, as far as like 3 or 4 years ago. So I'm not really sure if it's possible to deal with that. But the last thing I would say is if you're trying to delete your online presence, there are a few things you should Google and make sure that it's gone, you know, and make sure that you send those DMCA takedown notices to all of these sites. You should Google your email address. You should Google every phone number that you've used with that ad, and you should Google your name and any websites that you have had associated with that ad. And I think that that is sort of the best way to get rid of and make sure that all of the information you have online gets down.
Yeah, and another thing you can do is you can actually set up Google alerts for specific things. So this is something that especially people who've experienced a lot of online harassment have done this. They'll set up a Google search for their name or their name in combination with their email or things like that. So that's another thing that you can do. For the Internet Archive, it's pretty hard to get them to take stuff down, and it's something that you can try to do, but it's going to be really hard. And you know, as far as the DMCA takedowns go, in a lot of cases, you might not actually own these pictures, right? So that is going to be definitely another issue for folks. Christina, was there anything you wanted to add?
I mean, in some cases, you know, when it's not necessarily your content that, you know, that has been like scrubbed from your page or something, even just sending like a letter, just simply asking somebody to remove the content. You know, I know somebody on the side asked about like, how about getting personal information removed from Eros? You know, that might not be something that, you know, certainly not something the DMCA covers, but, you know, kindness and just being forward about what you want could also go a long way. So, you know, reaching out to you know, former web hosting companies, reaching out to you know, different places that you've submitted pictures or articles or whatever. Generally, if you were comfortable in sending them that information to begin with, you know, thinking that they were a good ally or good business partner, you asking them, you know, straightforward for them to remove that information might actually go a long way.
Yeah.
And then I would also say if you are doing interviews with, you know, with journalists, a lot of journalists, if you contact them, you know, fairly shortly after an article has been published, they're pretty receptive to you contacting them and being like, yo, you gave the name of the college that I went to when I was like talking to you as a sex worker. That's not cool. Can you change this for my anonymity? Most publications will change that. And, you know, even if it's in print, the online stuff stays online for a lot longer, and it's a lot more accessible. So getting that changed, even if it's already in print, does a lot of damage control.
Okay. All right. Oh, and that's a great, Savannah just put in a great link there from Sasha Gray. Okay. So, and I just FYI for the questions that I've seen till now, I just like took them out and put them into a Google Doc, so I should be able to answer those as I'm going through. And these are really great questions. Okay. All right. So with that, maybe I'll get back to the slideshow. Let me this screen share. All right. Cool. So that was just one super basic example, and you know, for most folks, there's going to be a lot of complicating factors in their own risk assessment. You know, like for example, when I'm doing my own risk assessment, particularly for the activism that I'm doing, I have to keep in mind I'm Syrian American. My dad is Syrian. My mom's American. So I have all of these issues that go along with making international phone calls. And you know, probably being on tons of lists because I'm Syrian and anarchist and an activist. So that's something that I think about for myself. So there's just all these different factors that could go into it, but just asking those questions is a good place to start. So I wanted to chat a little bit about encryption. Encryption is a process that takes information and makes it unreadable except for to a person who knows how to decrypt it back into a readable form. You use encryption every single day. A good example is, you know, really any, hopefully, any online shopping that you would do, your email, you know, when you sign into your email, that you should be at an HTTPS site, and that means that when you type in your password, it's encrypted as it travels over the internet. On the other end, Gmail or whoever your email provider is can decrypt it. So encryption has become a really big deal in the news recently because the government is trying to force Apple to put a backdoor into their the encryption of iPhones. The encryption of iPhones is pretty strong. The government has complained a lot about it, a lot about how it is interfering with their investigations, usually for drug crimes, unsurprisingly, for the war on drugs. So it can really foil the government. And when we talk about encryption on iPhones, we're talking about the phone itself. All of the data on the phone is encrypted, or sometimes you're just talking about the texts, the iMessaging. So those iMessages are encrypted, so the government can't read them. So encryption is something really important to know about, particularly for phones and for laptops. It's a setting you can actually turn on Android phones. On most new iPhones, it's automatically turned on, but you might want to check if you're using a smartphone. But if you're using an Android, you actually have to go into settings and turn on encryption. What that means is that if the government got your phone, even if they had a machine where they could pull the data off of it, they still wouldn't be able to read it because it would be encrypted. It would look like random numbers and letters to them. So this is a big protection for you if your phone ever gets seized. Same thing with your laptop. You can turn on full disk encryption, or you can use a service to do it. So I did just want to say a few words about site raids. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, Dia, before you go into that, someone had a question about are Blackberries better for data security or iPhones, or do you have any sense of which, just for phone technology, what is going to be the most secure?
Yeah. So currently, I hate to say this, but the sort of general consensus is that iPhone security is quite good, and that Android security is maybe not as good. I mean, a lot of this has to do with just that because iPhone is so proprietary, right? And because there's been a lot in the news about iPhone encryption being strong. Now, that being said, in one of these big cases, the FBI says that they figured out some other way to hack into the encrypted phone. We don't know what it was yet. There's been lots of speculation, but you know,
that's a big caveat for iPhones now. The newer the phone is, the less vulnerabilities it's going to have, but there is no sort of solid, like, this system is going to be way better than this other system. And we can talk a little bit more about choosing your tools also as we go through. So site raids, we already mentioned this. This is what people saw when they tried to go to my Redbook after it had been seized. And the site seizure both meant that the domain name was seized, but then also, of course, servers were seized by the FBI during this investigation for my Redbook and for RentBoy. And I actually don't know if they seized servers for the board that was in Seattle. But if anybody knows, feel free to jump in and chat.
Yeah, they did. They did seize the service.
Okay. So I think we already covered this, but I just want to reiterate. Don't panic, but do assume that your data has been compromised and do a risk assessment based on that. Don't expect the feds to come looking for you. There was the one story about the folks who were targeted in Seattle after that site seizure. For the most part, the charges that we're seeing are for facilitating prostitution, particularly anything that has to do with over state lines. And if the type of work that you do in any way could be construed to be facilitating prostitution, you should include that in your risk assessment, because that is a big deal. And that might be where wording becomes a really big thing for you.
And then I just want to add to that. I think that especially if you're a migrant sex worker, or a person of color, that's where it's going to come in even more severely, right? So I think Savannah pointed out that one of the two women charged with promoting prostitution wasn't really a facilitator. She was just sharing a workspace with another person. So, when they were putting out all of the traffickers they caught, it was one of those people was a Korean woman who is sharing a workspace with another Korean migrant sex worker. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to make. One of the other case studies that we didn't go through was for somebody who also has immigration stuff, and that's a whole other layer. And also, of course, people are not going to be exposed to the same level of risk just based on assumptions about trafficking, racial profiling, maybe their status as a trans person. Like there's all these other issues there. So all of these things being said, minimize the damage as much as you can. Cancel credit cards you used on the site if you did use credit cards, although that's something that don't recommend. Change your passwords. Don't reuse pictures. Those are all things that can keep some of that information from harming you later. Okay, so passwords. I want to talk about passwords. Like I said, if you don't do anything else after this today, the two things that everybody should do, passwords and just go through and do a social media sweep. I think hopefully there's lots of other things you'll be thinking of, but passwords are a big thing. A lot of people's accounts get hacked into just because they're reusing passwords. So that's a big issue. Don't reuse your passwords. Even if you have ads on like 10 different sites, you have to have 10 different passwords. Your password is only as strong as the weakest link. So you should be using a strong password, unique, long, and randomized in some way. What that means is that you're not making up the password based on words that you like, right? It can be randomized by using a method called diceware, which I'll do a screen share and show you what I mean by that a little bit later. You could use a password safe. This is an encrypted database that stores all of your passwords for you, and you have one master password that you type in, and then you have access to all your passwords. Obviously, with a password safe, it's only as strong as the master password, and you can't leave it open when you're not using it. Beware of password recovery questions. These are almost always based on information that is publicly available, right? Like, it's really not that hard to figure out the name of the street you grew up if somebody is trying to break into one of your accounts. Use two-factor authentication whenever possible. I know, you know, Twitter harassment is an issue. Two-factor authentication is where, in addition to putting in your password, you have to put in some other identifying information. Usually this is a code that is sent to you via text, sometimes also via a phone call. And this is a way that, so even if somebody got your Gmail password or even if somebody got your Twitter password, you still wouldn't be able to get into your account without having control of your phone. And I know for a lot of activists that I know who've dealt with Twitter harassment, people have actually figured out their password, right? And then they got a text saying, here's your verification code. Getting the text meant that person wasn't able to get into their account because they didn't get the verification code. So two-factor authentication can really save your ass. Yeah, I'll talk. Actually, maybe I should just pull up the Diceware page now. No, I'll do that. Okay, so let me pull up Diceware for you. What I'm talking about. Sorry about this. Okay.
So while you're doing that, I'm going to answer a quick question. People were asking about, yeah, I guess websites that require credit cards versus vanilla Visa or other, you know, payment processors, cash, money orders. And yeah, I mean, I think that credit cards, right, the more information you give your bank when you are creating this card, or the more information you give a phone company when you're, you know, getting a phone account, the more information that website is going to have if you use that phone or use that payment processor, right? So anything, you know, if you buy a vanilla Visa and you don't give your name, your address, your birth date and stuff, and you're buying an ad with that versus a bank account where you gave your social security number, and that is attached to this long, long, long list of, you know, in and out flux, including your apartment, you know, your kids, your grandparents, that gives a lot more information, you know, buying an ad with that. So, you know, cash will probably be the least expensive, buying, you know, or like least exposing, although that can also be traced. Something like vanilla Visa might be less so. Then it also goes the same with phones, right? Like if you're buying a burner phone, like let's say you buy a burner phone, but then one time you buy, you reload credits online using your personal information and a credit card, that reduces the security and privacy of that burner phone. So I'm going to go back to you now, Dia.
That's a great point, and that's actually a really good overall point to think about. You know, where you're trying to keep any identity separate, just think about all of the risk points associated with that. So an example I will use, like when I'm going to chat a little bit about street level surveillance later. So I never want to use a Clipper card. I live here in the Bay Area, right? I don't ever want to use a Clipper card, which is those cards that you reload with your credit card, because then all of my trips are attached to my credit card, right? However, there's also surveillance cameras all over in public transit. So there's this other way that they could get that information. So you do want to think about all of these links. Like if you're paying with something for cash and that's protecting your identity, what other ways could your identity be exposed, or could you eventually be tying those things together by using a credit card at any point? Okay, so we're not going to spend too long on this, but I just want to give you an idea of how, like, you don't have to get this complicated with creating your password, but Diceware is one of the most secure ways. So Diceware is a method for picking passphrases that uses dice to select words at random from a special list called the Diceware word list. Each word in the list has a 5-digit number. So you roll dice, depending on what number you get, you'll pick that word. So you're going to end up with, let's say I rolled this number, then this number, then this number. My passphrase would be claws, clink, clock, right? The complete list is 7,776 short words, abbreviations, and character strings. This is one of the most random ways that you can pick a password. or a passphrase. And I should say the reason we say passphrase instead of password is to try to get people to start thinking in terms of, okay, my password isn't like, you know, black feather 97, right? That's like just not enough. A good passphrase is like careless, tender, 2016, white, black. Like that's like it's way longer. So just to start you thinking about that. All right, and okay. Okay, so let's go back to the slideshow. Oops, I need to start from this first slide. Okay. Okay, so I just wanted to say a few brief words about malware and phishing, not because I think particularly for your line of work this is the biggest threat for you, but because it's just a little bit of information that can be helpful. And this is, I think, a threat for everybody these days. People's identities get stolen through malware and phishing. And so this is when an attacker sends, phishing is when an attacker sends an email or link that looks innocent, but it's actually malicious. It's a common way to infect your computer with malware, programs that hide on your computer and can remotely control it, steal information, or spy on you. A big example of malware that I think a lot of people have heard of is keystroke loggers. So this is a program that actually logs your keystrokes, meaning it can figure out your passwords if you type them in. So just a couple of tips to avoid this. Check URLs closely, like if somebody sends you a URL in an email, check it closely to make sure it's actually what you think it is. Check short links. So if you're using a link shortener like you see in Twitter, you don't always know where that's going. But you can go to checkshorturl.com, put it in, and it'll tell you where it's actually going. If you get a weird email and you're confused, verify it with the person who supposedly sent it. You know, you get an email with an attachment, you weren't expecting it. You can text somebody and say, I didn't know you were going to send me this document. Did you mean to? Instead of emailing documents back and forth, you can put files on a website or a shared service. You can open suspicious PDFs in an online document reader or other documents. So like Google, if you get a PDF in an email, it'll ask if you want to open it in Google Drive. You can do that, and that's one way to avoid opening it on your computer. And then you can use email authentication like PGP. So this is a unique signature that would show that an email actually came from you, or that an email you're receiving actually came from somebody else that says that they sent. And I just wanted to show you this example of this malware, or this phishing email that I got. It actually really creeped me out because it was right after I had booked an American Airlines flight. And I was like, what is happening, right? So that's a zip file that's attached. A zip file is a compressed file, and it's a very common way that malware is delivered because it could actually contain a program. It can contain an executable file that you may not even see when you unload the zip file. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a few specific tools, and then we're going to have time to go through more questions. And actually, this is awful, but I drank tons and tons of coffee, so I'm going to pause for just a second and use the restroom. So if there are questions, Catherine or Christina, that you've seen that you could answer, feel free. And I'm going to use the restroom really quickly. Sorry about that.
No worries. So actually, I'm going to ask Christina some of the questions that were asked before and now that are sort of legalese stuff. So tell me about advertisements. There's this chick who got 21 individual prostitution charges for Backpage ads. What should people who are posting Backpage ads be thinking about when making their ads, and what is the legality of of this chick getting 21 different charges?
Sure. So I'm less familiar about how they came to come up with those 21 charges, though I am familiar with her arrest. And essentially, and I'm going to share a document that I came out with a few months ago, actually, talking about this subject. So just give me a second, and then I can have people follow along if you are interested. I mean, as I think we all know, is, you know, if you're engaged in this type of work or in sex work, or even if you're not, as the case of people who are being profiled as sex workers, you know, nobody is safe from arrest. There's essentially, you know, two different charges that exist that people are most at risk of, and these are more or less the same in every state. The one is for prostitution, and in California, prostitution essentially means to engage in a sex act or lewd act in exchange for money, goods, services, drugs, or anything of value. And then solicitation of prostitution is the offering or agreeing to engage in prostitution. So a sex worker can be arrested and prosecuted even if they didn't initiate the agreement, and this is generally what people get busted for when they're advertising on websites. So, you know, people, generally speaking, people who are working indoors, you know, tend to find their clients on the internet, and then they're targeted by law enforcement through the ads. So, you know, cops end up posing as clients, and they respond to an ad. They ask to meet in person for a session, and it's at that point where people get arrested. You know, if you are never interfacing with a cop, you know, they're not going to come knocking on your door. However, in many cases, you know, a sex worker's ad or the subsequent phone calls, text messages, or emails that are exchanged between the undercover officer and the sex worker could qualify as enough evidence to make an arrest for solicitation. And I just want to give a little bit of a note here. In order to make an arrest, an officer only needs to have an idea that there's like a 50% likelihood of illegal activity happening. So it's not the same level of evidence required for somebody who's going through trial. It's a much lower standard, which is why, you know, in some cases when people go to a trial, you know, they can get off even though they have this arrest on their record. But, you know, arrest patterns vary by city, county, and by state, and it depends on the local law enforcement's resources and what their current policies are. You know, so in this article that I shared, you know, I'm going through, you know, some of the things that people believe are, you know, would prevent law enforcement from targeting them, and I go through each thing individually. So some people believe that calling payment a donation will shield them from liability, using a disclaimer of payment is for my time only, not for sex, these types of things. And in this document I go through how and why they don't actually provide any protection. In the case of that woman that was arrested from Backpage, you know, she did use some of this language, presumably thinking that would protect her. But if the website itself, you know, Backpage, which is known for prostitution, you know, just having an advertisement on the website itself will open yourself up to liability, because it's going to be seen as, you know, you're offering services. And we can certainly talk about this more, you know, later if we have more time.
Awesome, thank you so much, Christina.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, I'm back, and I do just want to, because I saw there was a few questions about passwords that maybe I'll just touch on really quickly. So I mentioned very briefly using a password manager. So a good example is KeePassX. This is a free password manager that you can download. Somebody asked, is it a bad idea to store passwords in a document on your computer? Yes, definitely. Don't do that. If you're going to store passwords anywhere, it is
if you are actually using secure passwords and you're reusing passwords for every site, or you're not reusing passwords for every site, you're using a unique password for every site, you are not going to be able to remember them all. There's no way I could remember them all. I have literally, at this point, probably several hundred passwords. So that's why you would want to use a password manager. And the password manager will store the passwords on your computer, but they'll be encrypted. So if somebody was to gain access to your computer, if they didn't know that master password, your passwords would still be safe. So unique passwords, don't worry, you don't have to try to remember them all, but be very careful using a password manager. And a really useful tool for this, I'm going to talk a little bit more about about EFF's surveillance self-defense site, but this right here, I'm going to put this link in. This is a really helpful tool there. Yeah, it's a KeyPassX, but there's a link in the surveillance self-defense tutorial I just sent you. Okay, so the slideshow. Okay, so I wanted to mention Signal just because it's a really easy to use tool. The trade-off, the negative part of using Signal is that sometimes you won't get your text messages right away because it's not actually texts. It's only it only sends things using data. But what it does is allows you to make end-to-end encrypted phone calls and send end-to-end encrypted messages. What end-to-end encryption means is that it is encrypted from the time you send it to the time that the person receives it. So it's encrypted with a private key that you have, and then they decrypt it with a public key. Or sorry, that's with email. So with Signal, with texts and with phone calls, these are, if the government was to seize your phone, they got all of these texts, they wouldn't be able to read them because they're encrypted. Again, it's only over data. It's an app that you download. It's available for Android and for iPhone. What is on the screen now is an example of a phone call made using Signal. The reason that it says Klaxon Burlington down there is that when you make a phone call with Signal, the person on the other end is going to have words on their screen. You're supposed to have the same words on your screen, and that's your handshake. That's how you make sure you're speaking to the person you're actually speaking to. So the reason that these things are helpful, again, it's going to locally encrypt all of the text messages on your phone. And it's also, if you're concerned about your text messages, being intercepted while you're sending them, this would make that impossible for the police, as far as we know. As far as you know, the NSA has not cracked this encryption, and it's still pretty solid. So you really don't have to do anything different when using Signal, except for you have to have data service. Again, it's not over regular phone lines, and you have to download this app, and you have to just know how to use the app. So you'll set a password for it, and you'll have the option of either making a regular call or a Signal call to anybody else who's using it. So this only works with other people who are using Signal.
And Nadia, Dia, can I clarify something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So this app does not work with a third-party phone service, right? So like if you're using like Google Voice or something, you couldn't actually use both apps. Is that right? You have to be using like the phone number that's associated with your phone? Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, so that can also be a pretty big limitation. This is something that you might really just want to be using, to communicate with other folks. If there's communications that you like, not necessarily with clients, but if you can afford to have a burner smartphone, this might be really helpful for you.
Oh, and can you go over a little bit, someone asked this before, like Google Voice versus Skype versus...
Yeah, that's in the slides later.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
You know what, I think I'm going to skip over off the record messaging. Let's just go right to phones. So phones. Phones are a problem for a big variety of reasons. They're also completely necessary for any work, particularly for sex work, right? So a few things to keep in mind. I just wanted to say a few words about burner phones. So burner phone is a separate prepaid cell phone that you use for a specific purpose and then discard of. Also, just using a separate prepaid cell phone, even if you continue to use it for a while, you can have a separate prepaid cell phone that is not the phone that you use for daily life. As Catherine said, if you're doing that, you want to be paying in cash. You want to be aware of the fact that there's probably surveillance where you're purchasing the phone. So if you were to get in really big trouble for some reason, that's a loophole there. And a lot of the stuff I'm talking about is available on this surveillance self-defense tutorial that I have a link to on the bottom of this slide. That being said, for your purposes, if you can't afford to get an anonymous prepaid cell phone, this is probably the safest thing you can do. If you can't, phone number rewriting services. I've gotten a lot of questions about these for a variety of purposes. So the big thing to keep in mind is that a service like Google Voice can expose a lot of personal information. So you want to be very clear about the company that you're using, what their privacy policy is, what information you might be exposing, and what the risk is there. So for example, with Google Voice, they're going to know all of the numbers that are calling you. But more importantly, Google Voice automatically transcribes voicemails to texts, right? Consider what information that could expose. That's another sort of way that the government could potentially get information if you're being prosecuted for something, right? So just depending on how the service works, that's another thing to think about. A good resource, in terms of researching these companies, one helpful resource, I'm going to turn on screen sharing again, is, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to broadcast a question that two people asked. Burner apps. So after you finish talking about what you're talking about, if you could touch on how safe is it to use burner apps?
Yeah, and actually I can just say a few words about that now because I just looked into them over the last couple of days. So burner apps are like any other app. I can't give you is the Who Has Your Back screen, is that showing now?
Yes.
Great. So burner apps are just like any other apps. I can't tell you without looking at the app, looking at the terms of service, and looking at it works, how safe it actually is. And these terms of service are not like written in a way that makes them super understandable, but it's still something that you want to take a look at, and you want to research the company and see if you can figure out how compliant they've been with law enforcement in the past. Because you're still, the app itself still knows, like if you have it on your phone, right, you have that app on your phone, first of all, so that's showing that you're using some way to route your calls. The app knows what your phone number is, and they know what calls you're making. So it is a way of obscuring that data maybe from the government initially, but they have all of that information still. And for the most part, we've seen like companies have been pretty, until they get public pressure, they usually don't fight super hard. And so that's one of the reasons I pulled up this report. And so I know that's not a very satisfying answer. And if burner apps are something that tons of folks are using, and this is a big question, I'm happy to, if people want to send me links to the apps that they're using, I can take a look at the terms and also ask my technologist friends if they could give me more information about those apps specifically. The other thing to think about is, what sort of permissions are those apps asking for? Anybody who uses an Android is familiar with when you download a new app, and it's just like, okay, it's going to have access to everything. This app wants access to your identity. It wants access to your address book. So how much do you trust the people who've created it is the question.
So unfortunately, those sorts of small companies are not going to be on this report. But the Who Has Your Back with Government Data Requests report, I think, is from EFF, is very helpful. And it's also just the kind of thing to think about when you're doing research. Like, you can maybe find other resources as well. But let's go down to Google. Google has 3 stars out of 5. Follows industry-accepted best practices. Everybody except for WhatsApp has that score, or has that star. Tells users about government data demands, not always. Discloses policies on data retention, not always. Content removal requests, and then public policy. Do they oppose backdoors? And that's what I was talking about. The government's trying to force Apple to build software that even if it encrypts your information, the government could still access it, right? So Google publicly opposes that. They let you know when the government forces them to take down content, but they might not let you know about data demands. So that is concerning, right? I think probably another company on here, well, there's a lot of other companies on here that folks on this webinar are probably using. Facebook, which is actually improved a little bit. Snapchat, not so great, by the way, if anybody's using Snapchat. Twitter, WhatsApp, I know, is something that folks have asked me a lot about the security of WhatsApp. But so this is just something to keep in mind. You can do a little bit of research on how these companies protect you or don't protect you. Okay, so let me go back to the slideshow. Towers, right? So you might want to consider turning off location services. Another way that will help you is with geotagging of photos. This is a big one. Most of us use our phones as our camera. A lot of us are posting pictures online. You're probably posting pictures in ads if you're using any of those sorts of online services. If you haven't turned off geotagging in your phone settings, then there is going to be an extra layer of data in any picture that you post that includes location information. So this could be really, really dangerous. So turn off geotagging. If you have photos that you're already using and you're not sure if they have been geotagged, there's actually a free program you can use, which I'll put a link to in the chat. It's called GIMP Image Manipulator, where you can resave the photo and take out all of that location data. There's other services you can use. I just like to recommend GIMP because it's free open source software. So think about geotagging. Put a password on your phone and don't give it up to the cops. This also goes for your computer. Your computer should have a password on its initial screen. Your phone should have a password. It should be long as you can possibly make it. There's more information about passwords and password strength in the surveillance self-defense link that I gave you. Definitely make it more than 4 numbers. That's just really not going to do much. So you should know with your devices, if you are stopped or harassed by the police, even if you're arrested, you do not have to give them the password to your phone. The only person that can make you give that up, and this is because of a good Supreme Court decision, the only person who can make you give that up is a judge. If you get a court order, you might have to give up your password, right? But at an initial stop, you don't have to. This also goes for the border. Now, if you don't give up your password at the border, you could be detained. So there are more consequences at the border because you have less Fourth Amendment rights against search and seizure. But for most of us, average interaction with the police, don't give up that password. Encrypt your phone. Just turn on encryption for your phone. You can do this in your settings. When you initially do it, if you have an Android, and again, a lot of iPhones are already, the new ones, a lot of them are already automatically encrypted. Androids are not. So you'll have to go into your settings and turn on encryption, and it's going to take a little while. You won't be able to use your phone for about an hour usually while it does this. it's really worth it. Again, this means if law enforcement gets your phone, even if they could plug your phone into a machine and make a complete copy of it, they wouldn't be able to read your text messages. They wouldn't know what's on your phone. Same thing with your computer. And for Macs, you can just turn it on. Same with Linux, and for Windows, there are services you can use. So I know there were some questions about VPNs and about Tor. For folks who don't know, VPN stands for Virtual Private Network. It allows your computer to send and receive data across shared or public networks as if it's directly connected to a private network. So a lot of people, if you've ever worked remotely, you might be using a VPN. But you can also sign up for VPNs. A lot of times people ask about what the best VPN to use is. And you'll want to do your own research, look at the privacy policy of the VPN, look at what their partnerships are. I use private internet access. It's a very popular VPN. It's very easy to set up. It gives you lots of options. So if you sign up for private internet access, and I think it's something really cheap, it's like $4 or $5 a month. But if you sign up, you can actually tunnel your connection through all different countries, which is cool. You can private internet access. I also know works with some organizations that I like, where you can buy a PIA membership and then they give donations to that organization, which makes me like them a little bit more. RiseUp also has a VPN service. It's not always totally reliable. So you'll just want to do a little bit of research into the VPN yourself, and know why is it that you want to use it. For me, the biggest reason I use a VPN is because I use public Wi-Fi. Right, when you were using public Wi-Fi, your data is totally exposed. So I use a VPN when I'm using a public network in a cafe or in an airport. Another reason people use VPNs is to circumvent censorship on a network that blocks certain sites or services. And for folks doing sex work, that might be necessary if you have to use public Wi-Fi that blocks access to sites like Backpage. I also wanted to say a few words about Tor. Tor helps anonymize internet usage. And I should say, VPNs don't anonymize you. They could protect what you're doing from the local network, but they're not actually going to hide where you're going. The VPN will still know all that information, the VPN service. Tor is different. It's more about anonymity. You can use it by going to, and there are tutorials for using Tor, I should say, on surveillance self-defense that are really helpful, as well as the Security in a Box resource that is on this slideshow. But really the easiest way to use it is just get the Tor browser. What it does is hide the source and destination of internet traffic by routing it through various relays across the internet. So if you're concerned about the fact that you're going to sites where you post your ads, really you just want to anonymize your browsing in any way, Tor is a good resource for that. I think it's really important to give the caveat that if you're using Tor, that can sometimes draw more government attention to you. The government doesn't like that it hasn't figured out how to crack Tor. If you're using Tor, it still doesn't, the government, as far as we know, based on slides we've seen from Snowden, the government still can't figure out what exactly it is you're doing. They do know that you're using Tor, though, because they can see that your internet connection goes into one of these relays. So that's the sort of trade-off there. Tor has allowed people all over the world to circumvent censorship and has kept people anonymous. So it's a service, but it comes with that caveat. So I wanted to say a few words about street-level surveillance. I'm not going to say a ton, but just that this is another thing to keep in mind. I gave you that example of, if I was trying to keep my location and my movement secret, there's surveillance cameras all over. So the things that I've included here, the left side, that's an NYPD surveillance camera. The upper right corner, that's an automated license plate reader that is on top of a police car. Automated license plate reader can very rapidly capture license plate numbers and then stores them in a database. These are being used all over the country. And then in the bottom right corner, that's a stingray, also known as an IMSI catcher or a cell site simulator. And these are devices that trick your phone into connecting with them in order to capture identifying information about your phone and be able to very accurately know your location based on that identifying information. Stingrays, cell site simulators can also capture, there's a lot of other things they can do, I will say. The US government has said they're only using them for location tracking. But I just mention these things because particularly if you're ever doing any sort of street-based work, it's really important to try to pay attention to what sort of street-level surveillance is in use in your area. Okay, and we are almost at the end. Some of the resources that I've been talking about, before I go on to questions, I'm actually going to pull up SSD so we could go over it a little bit. Surveillance self-defense from EFF is really helpful. Another similar site with lots of tutorials is Security in a Box. Specifically for if you're concerned about harassment or doxing, the Crash Override Network Doxing Prevention Guide is really useful. I think especially for people who are doing any sort of sex work-related activism online, I strongly urge you to check out this doxing prevention guide and try to scrub your data. But actually for everybody, if you are concerned about your personal address being available online or anything like that, there are all these awful sites like Spokeo, People.com, White Pages, where if you just search somebody's name, their address can come up. So if somebody gets your legal name, they can find out tons of information about you. So you actually have to go to all of these sites and ask them to take your information down. It's really shitty. And it should be illegal, but it's not. So I think that's useful for anybody who's concerned about any sort of harassment. Social media self-defense, this is from my friend El Armageddon, and this is just giving you more tools to think about what you're posting online. And then hackerspaces and crypto parties, especially for people who are interested, who are doing work that's very online based. If you're interested in getting more information or learning more about the tools that we've talked about, this can be a really good resource for you. Here in the Bay Area, there's a great space called Law Space, Liberating Ourselves Locally, and it's a people of color and women-led hackerspace that has Monday night skill shares. In New York, there's a great resource, the Harlem Crypto Party, and this is a great place to, if you want to learn more about encryption or anything, that's a great resource. But wherever you are, there's, if you're in a city, there's probably hackerspaces or crypto parties available to you. So before, and this is great. Savannah, can you, sorry, Catherine, can you share the questions, the Google Docs link with me again? And then while you're doing that, I'm just going to go to the surveillance self-defense site and share a little bit of how to use that most effectively. Okay. So SSD has tons of information. Nice thing about it is it's also available in lots of different languages. So basically, any of the tools that we talked about today that you're interested in learning more about, if you go to the index of SSD, you will probably be able to find it. These animated overviews, by the way, are really great. AJ Plus made them, and I think they're really good introductions. AJ Plus is Al Jazeera. But yeah, so like the password stuff, KeePassX, that's the password manager that we were talking about. Also, I think this is really, really helpful, how to delete your data securely. Two-factor authentication we were talking about. So, so these are tutorials for specific tools and doing specific things. There's also just these overviews, the password one. And then there's also just these briefings that I think are helpful that go over big topics. So that's SSD, another really interesting and good resource that I haven't gotten to look at as much, but I think is helpful, is the Securing Online and Offline Freedoms for Women. So this is a more, it's a security guide that was created by feminists. So I think it's got some really helpful stuff here in these tutorials. So yeah, those are just two really helpful online resources if you want to go into any of these things more. So I'm going to turn off my screen sharing and then start. Oh, great. Okay.
You can open this up on your screen as well if you would like, but this is, I just highlighted in yellow, I think some of the questions that maybe, you know, either haven't been covered or so if you want to open it up on your screen so you can move through it better.
Cool. Yeah, I got it. So, okay. So I know we talked a little bit about you know, stuff that you've already done online and thinking about how to get rid of that. And I guess this question, how to delete. I'm guessing that's like for emails that you've already sent. And I will say that's sort of one of the fundamental things to keep in mind. Once something has gone to a third party online, it's like almost impossible to get it taken down, and that definitely goes for Gmail. Google is going to store all of your email whether or not you would like them to. And if there is any sort of, you know, if you find yourself in any sort of legal proceedings, there's very little that you can do. Texting, I think maybe that question was just about, if that was about texting more securely, Signal can help with that. And again, I will say, you know, you should, I used to work for a defense attorney who did medical marijuana criminal defense, and I would just see these like really, really long printouts of text messages from people. It was really like people had really revealed a lot of information. So, you know, if you're using Signal to text, those texts could not be used against you, but really anything that you've sent, and you know, and they can get that information directly from the phone provider, even if you've deleted it off of your device, they can still get that information. Okay. I'm gonna look at the ones that are highlighted first, and then I'll go over all of these. Maintaining location and computer privacy during correspondence. So I think, you know, one of the things that we touched on was just in terms of pictures, being careful that any pictures that you're sharing are not giving away your location. Let's see.
Yeah, and I want to add, I think Kitty brought this up. Kitty, or if you're still there, I'll bring you on. But I think that a lot of photographs will have a bunch of information. You know, everything from the date the photograph was taken to the location of where the photograph was. Is there any way to scrub information, right, that is embedded within the photograph?
Yeah. So maybe I'll just do a screen share right now of me, because I think this is a big enough one that it might be helpful for me to show what that would look like. So I'm just going to open up a random photo.
And while you're opening that, someone asked, while working as an escort assistant, do I need to worry about promotion of prostitution charges? And the answer is absolutely yes. Unfortunately, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can get charged with promoting prostitution for letting someone work out of your apartment if you know that they're working there. You can get charged if you let someone use your credit card. You can get charged if you are having a doubles appointment with someone else, while, right, and you're the person who, who answered the phone and placed the ad. You can get charged if you, I mean, honestly, and Christina, you can probably answer this, but like, if you have links on your website that's like, oh yeah, these are my friends, we do doubles together, could that be construed as promoting prostitution? Or Dia, you might also be able to answer this.
Potentially. It all really depends on what kind of evidence they can bring against you. With those types of things, it's different by state, what exactly is in the statutory code. But if you're sharing money, if you are soliciting a client and then, sharing the money that you receive, like between two people, there is the potential of getting a promotion of prostitution charge or a pimping charge.
Okay. For some reason, okay. For some reason, I'm not able to do this right now.
Yeah, and then someone noted that it seems like the penalties for assistance are a lot tougher than for providers, and it depends on the state, but the general trend of sort of the end demand movement and the anti-trafficking movement in general is to increase penalties for third parties. So in Illinois, it's gone up from being the same charge for a provider to being a class 4 felony, which is our lowest level, and you're seeing similar laws pop up in multiple states. While you're working on that, yeah.
Okay. The reason that I'm not able to do this is because the reason I'm not able to scrub this is because I don't actually have any photos that have any of this data. But basically, if you use, it's called GIMP editor, GIMP image editor. It's just a free, actually. You can then, if you open up an image in that, and then you just hit export, it's going to give you an option to save what's called EXIF data, and that's the data that you're trying to scrub. So, I could actually write up a really short tutorial on this and just share it with everybody, because it's pretty easy to do. I just have to take a picture that actually has that data. That's mine does.
That sounds great.
Yeah, so I'll do that and I'll share it with folks. But just so you know, like if you have that turned off on your phone, you're not even going to have to worry about scrubbing that data in the first place. So let's see. Is it better to get an overseas website host or email hoster? Yeah, so I think it's a really good idea to look into what website host you're using and what their policies are, and a lot of people do prefer using overseas hosters. In the past, I have been lazy and just asked my friends, what hosting service do you like that has the best policies? But if you find folks that are using a hosting service that they really like, that they feel is pretty secure, and just share that information. But yeah, I mean, if something is being hosted overseas, that can sometimes give it more security. Okay, I'm just gonna email storage, form sent via website, and texting. Okay. So for crossing international borders, again, another really helpful
resource from EFF is this, things to consider when crossing the U.S. border. Let me share this screen with y'all. So I think anybody who's going to be crossing the border, this is definitely something to take a look at. And it explains what I was talking about, that so if a border agent asks you for your passphrase, you don't have to comply, but particularly at the border, you could be detained. It could be a problem for you. Now, that being said, it's still really important to know. Another thing that has been happening recently is that people have been forced to turn on their computers, like actually at the security checkpoint in the airport. If you find yourself in that situation, yeah, you can turn on your computer. You don't type in your passphrase. That's just not something that I would do. But do know, again, that your rights at the border are a little bit less than they are every day. So, share again.
And then, do you guys have any tips specifically for sex workers when crossing the border? Christina, do you have anything to add to what Dia just shared and said? Christina?
Oh, yeah, here.
Yeah.
There we go. Yeah, I don't have anything to add. I know there's a lot of different considerations. Some of it certainly like the technology you have on you and putting as many obstacles, as Dia was saying, between the person who's going to be trying to look at your information and your technology. So you utilizing passwords. And I just heard about somebody who was crossing a border and ended up getting deported, actually. Because she didn't have passwords on her things, and TSA was looking at her phone messages, but also she was carrying a diary with her, where she like a paper diary where she was had described information about herself that was used to incriminate her. So just being like hyper aware of all items that you're taking with you, both technology, in the sense of electronics, but also even our more antiquated technology like paper documents, and the cash that you have on you if you're carrying cash.
So yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I say just like put passwords on everything that you can put passwords on. So I do want to get to just a few more of these questions before we have to wrap up. Just a few I can answer relatively quickly. One of the questions was, how concerned should I be about my years of not protecting myself and my data because I didn't know how? Just do what you can now, and know that some of the stuff that we talked about is actually going to help you deal with that, right? Like the doxing prevention guide, that will help you. There will probably be, if you haven't been protecting your data a lot, there's probably going to be a lot of information about you on a site like SWOP-USA, right? But you can get some of that taken down. So, we've all, like, I have all sorts of pictures online that I wish were not online, but they are. So, just do your best and know what your risk is. Know what information is up there that you can't get down. People were asking a lot of questions about depositing cash and things like that, and Christina, I don't know if you have anything to add, but just yeah, if you're paying taxes on things, that's not a concern. If you are not paying taxes and you're posting cash, and you're depositing cash, that can be a red flag for the IRS. And so, as much as you can, you want to avoid depositing things that you're not reporting. And there are all sorts of ways to think about how to work around having to pay for things with a bank account. Like I, for many years, only used a cell phone that I could pay for with cash in person, and
sure actually that all of you have more tips for that than I would. One thing to think about in terms of paying for ads with credit cards, of course, is prepaid cards. Bitcoin is another option, and that's a whole can of worms that I don't want to open on this webinar, but that's another option for folks. Let's see. And then somebody asked a really good question, are you going to address the capabilities of the average local police department? If not, how does one research that? So if you're in an area where there's folks that are doing anti-surveillance activism, you will probably be able to get a wealth of information. So for New York, Chicago, Seattle, Los Angeles, the Bay Area, there are a lot of people who've been doing anti-surveillance activism and really monitoring what sort of capabilities law enforcement has. So in Chicago, for instance, the Lucy Parsons lab has created a primer on the Chicago Police Department surveillance. So if you're in Chicago and you're wondering, you can just Google that. The other thing is police departments really like to brag about some of their capabilities or strategies, so even just Googling. You can also, if you're really interested and you want to get active on this stuff, you can do Public Records Act requests. You should definitely assume, the one thing I will say for all local police departments is that even if they're super unsophisticated, you should assume that they're doing social media monitoring. Okay, and I see that we're at about time, so I should probably turn it over to Catherine and Christina if you guys have any last words and want to wrap up.
Yeah, I would say that before we wrap up, I just want to address the question about bank accounts. So an issue with financial institutions is that, regardless of whether or not they're going to turn you over to the IRS, they are monitoring your bank account. And a lot of people have had Chase banks closed because they are depositing large chunks of cash, and they're also using their same debit card that they're depositing large chunks of cash into their bank account with to place ads on things like Arrows or Backpage. So it's really the problematic thing, I think, with with private financial institution discrimination becomes the coupling of atypical deposits of cash with using your bank account to purchase things that are associated with quote-unquote illegal activities. So using it to buy, lots of flights, like, using it to buy, adult entertainment ads, things like that. I think that those start to raise red flags, and banking institutions have become a lot more cautious over these kinds of things, especially for a number of reasons, but yeah, I think that's what I would add to that. And then in terms of borders, I think something that we had talked about on our calls before this webinar is that your biometric data gets tapped at the border, so your face. So then if you are traveling around the country and posting Backpage ads, that are not face blurred or that show your, physical, show identifying features about you, there is technology that can be used to track you once you've crossed the border. And I think that is sort of a scary thing. So be really careful about geotagging if you are a migrant who's coming into the U.S. and engaging in adult work, and being really cautious about what images you share on social media or on advertising sites. Ina, do you have some last words?
Sure. The only remaining thing that I can really think of to touch on in this moment that we haven't mentioned already is thinking about how people use their Amazon wish list. Amazon collects a lot of data, spanning from legal name, credit card information, home address, and for people, porn performers, people who do more intimate forms of sex work, are sharing these things on email, on social media. And there are some ways to limit the amount of information that is being seen by customers or people who are going to be purchasing things from your wish list, but that doesn't hide the information from Amazon and potentially your credit card processor if you are also using that personal Amazon wish list to, to buy things for yourself, whether it's kitty litter or, hygiene items, whatever. So thinking about the way we do our shopping, especially as more online shopping is happening, really, I would say attempt to limit the overlap of information that's going from your sex worker identities to your, private personal information.
Great. And Dia, do you want to have a little bit of a final word, and then I'll thank you guys for doing this and wrap up?
Sure. Thank you so much for bringing up both of you. These are things that, we had chatted about and I didn't mention. So yeah, I just do want to say again, please feel free to add any comments you want to that, the copy of case studies Google Doc, and we're gonna clean that up and share it. Catherine, do we have did folks put in their email addresses when they registered for this?
Yes, we did. So I will share email addresses with you, or what would you prefer, Dia? I can email out. Why don't you give me data and then I'll email it out to the people.
Yeah, and I will say I apologize to everybody for the fact that your emails were collected. That's something that I always think about, like, that is a point of data. So I apologize for that.
Yeah.
But so we'll actually think about what the best way to share out this stuff is. I mean, I'm probably just going to post it publicly as well. Not without, like, just the case studies, obviously that has nobody's information on it, as well as the webinar. So those things will, the slides, so those things will be available. And please feel free if you have any feedback, stuff that I missed, like really bad assumptions that I was making, anything like that, please feel free to email me. I want feedback, and I hope that this is a continuing thing and we keep sharing this information with everybody.
Yes. And thank you guys so much for thank you guys all for joining this webinar, and most importantly, thank you so much, Dia, for the amazing PowerPoint, and Dia and Kristen and Kitty, if you're watching or in the background, for helping to organize this. This was really helpful and really incredible. So after this webinar is over, I'm going to edit out anything that could be identifying for people, and then it will be posted on YouTube, and then I will share that information on the SWOP-USA website, and I think it'll also be shared in the Facebook group. And then any of the subsequent information, so the case studies, as well as any of the notes that we took during the call regarding questions besides the PowerPoint that aren't really addressed in this YouTube video. These will also be shared in the Facebook event, as well as on the SWOP-USA website. So keep on checking the Facebook event, the SWOP-USA website, and then I'm assuming perhaps also Red Light Legal. So thank you again so much for joining this webinar, and we hope to have more of these soon. Woo!
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, bye.
Thank you.